All right, guys, welcome back. It's Wednesday, so that means we have our local attorney, Alex Stanford, joining us. And so 2 weeks ago, Alex, good afternoon. Welcome back.
Good afternoon, Taylor.
So 2 weeks ago, we talked about qualified immunity. This week, we're talking about some examples of qualified immunity for the viewers. So how would you give an example so that we can better understand what it is?
Well, okay, so like I said last week, qualified immunity is the attempt by the courts, because it is not the interests of the public and the police, as far as, we don't want to punish good cops who are just trying to do their jobs, but at the same time, we want to be able to give a road of recovery to innocent victims. Mm-hmm. So I had a case not that long ago that involved a young lady getting arrested because the warrant had her name on it, but it was for a different person who had her first and last name. And she tried to explain to the officers that, that's not me. The other person has a different birthday. She's 20 years older than me. She's bigger than me. And they didn't really care. They just arrested her anyway. And they tried to claim qualified immunity because they were saying, look, they were just doing their jobs. But once they were put on notice that they had the wrong person and that they didn't even bother to do a cursory check on her social security number, her date of birth, any of her biometrics, that whole defense kind of went out the window. And so they were forced to pay on that one. But if you look at some of the more recent cases of the shootings that we've been having around the country, there raises some real tough issues of how does qualified immunity get implemented there, where you have someone who doesn't have a weapon, but there are these questions of fact about with the shooting in Atlanta of Mr. Brooks. There's a question of whether or not the taser could even have been fired again. He was running away, and so it becomes very difficult to play out the whole, well, what should the officer have known at that time? And that gives rise to one of the biggest criticisms that qualified immunity is attacked by, and that is that the way it's implemented by the courts is that in order for qualified immunity to fail, you have to basically have a case already on the books that is so close to the fact pattern in question so as to be able to say, oh, the officer should have known that this particular act that he was taking was not going to be kosher with that previous case law. And so the criticism is that, well, most times things come up, there isn't a case law that's exactly like that. So it ends up giving rise to this idea that, well, the first one's free. The first time the cops want to trample on your rights, as long as it's a little bit different than another case, then they can get away with it. And that's a very good argument. And so it becomes very difficult to parse out the right way to implement this idea of qualified immunity, because while it's trying to do something good and noble, the way it has been implemented ends up being almost like bureaucratic, where they're not thinking about it in terms of competing the equities against each other, and instead they're just taking a very small-minded approach of like, well, if we can't find a case that specifically says they can't do this, then we're going to act like they can until the first time where it comes up. And that's a real tough policy to have, because the people need something a bit more tractable. So it's almost like they're erring on the other side. Before they had the policy, it was bad. Then they implemented it, and now they're construing it so narrowly, so where qualified immunity almost means absolute immunity unless there's a case directly on point. So I think getting rid of it entirely is not really the answer. We need to make sure that we start reading it and articulating it in a way that goes back to that initial balancing act of, look, what should the cops have reasonably known at the time when they were doing whatever they were doing, versus the rights involved of the public. And I don't know if we're going to get that. It looks like the pendulum is swinging too far back in the other direction. And so I don't see an easy solution happening, but it's a very interesting question.
It is a very interesting question, Alex. Thank you for coming on to explain it. We'll see you next week. And before we go to break, guys, let's send it on over to Adam.